One of the key questions that we're going to look at in this unit, or at least the first part of this unit, is what, if anything, are Americans entitled to as citizens? The word entitled is a loaded word because it usually means that you get something for nothing. But of course, we're taxpayers, right? We pay a good chunk of our income to the federal government and we expect some things in return for that. Obviously, we want a military that's going to protect our country and keep us safe. We want clean water, we want clean air, we want navigable roads and highways, we want police and fire departments to serve our needs when there are emergency situations. We want a lot of things from the government, but the question becomes, where do you draw the line? What things should government be helping people to secure, and what things should people secure for themselves? And so this is just a list of some of the basic things that we've debated over the years in terms of what role should government play in these different areas. Certainly, the healthcare has been a big issue over the last 10 or 15 years that we've been talking about, especially in the campaigns of late. To what extent should healthcare be covered by the government? Should it be a single payer Medicare for all government run program? Or should we have private insurance that takes care of healthcare, but the government helps people who can't afford it? There's a whole host of different opinions on that issue. Education, society, I think, has accepted the idea that we're going to provide a free public education from kindergarten through 12th grade. But now, of course, we're talking about things like free preschool and free college. So to what extent should government be involved in making sure that all citizens can get access to an education? Housing assistance, food, programs like the food stamp program. Should we be expanding that program and getting more assistance to people who need it, or should we be cutting back and trying to make people more self-sufficient? Clothing, if people don't have access to decent clothing, should there be government programs to help with that? Employment, if you can't find a job, how much government assistance should there be? Should you get paid by the government a temporary salary while you're trying to find work? We do have such a thing as unemployment benefits or unemployment insurance. And then just basic financial security. Whether we're talking about Social Security when you retire, where the government gives you some supplementary income, or whether we're talking about things like a universal basic income. Andrew Yang talked about that on the campaign trail, that every American should get $1,000 a month. And then beyond that, whatever they earn is up to them. These are real questions that we're still debating today. And they were major questions that society was debating around the turn of the century, 1900, in the aftermath of the rapid industrial and urbanization that we saw. So our big question, and there's not an immediate answer to it, but our big question to consider throughout this unit is, to what extent should government become involved in the lives of private citizens? How far is too far? And we are going to be looking at some supplementary videos that are on the Hyperdoc that really kind of illustrate some attempts to regulate the behavior of individuals by the government that seem to go to a pretty intrusive level, right? And so we have to make some choices and some decisions about when we think we should draw the line and say government needs to mind its business, and when we need to empower people to make their own appropriate decisions. This is just a quick review slide. Last unit, we learned about social Darwinism, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but just remember that social Darwinism kind of states the concept that the government has no role in picking the winners and losers. Society will just sort that out for itself. And those who are best suited to survive and to move up and to grow and to prosper will do that. Those who are not in a position to do that, it's not our responsibility to lift them up. There is an emerging viewpoint that pushes back against social Darwinism during this time period, and that viewpoint is called pragmatism. Pragmatism espouses that through trial and error and making adjustments and providing some basic safeguards and regulations, that the government can empower people to grow and thrive and become contributing members of society. We shouldn't be writing off individuals as losers who are unable to compete. We should be giving them the basic things that they need to lead a decent quality of life and then seeing where they go from there, right? And until we've at least provided some of those basic things for them, how can we expect them to be successful? So pragmatists argue that everybody has an opportunity to succeed, that not everybody needs exactly the same supports, but that we ought to try to provide some of those basic supports so that people have a fair chance at being successful. Out of this comes a new political division within the country, a group known as the Progressives. And progressives they could be Democrats or Republicans, they could be liberal or conservative. They tend to have a more liberal mindset because liberals tend to believe in change and progressives believe in change. But some of them are more socially conservative, some of them are more economically conservative. But they're dedicated to political, social, and economic reforms. They believe that reforms need to be made to make real progress in the country. And we're not just talking about economic progress and technological progress, but literally changing people's quality of life, making people's quality of life better. And they thought that government was the tool that we should use to try to bring this change about. That government was going to be the vehicle of change, and that more government regulation and more government reform was necessary to make these changes happen. Two basic kinds of progressives: analysts and activists. Analysts are those who study the human problems and kind of provide the data that explains things like public health issues, housing issues, overcrowding, poverty, some of the stuff related to immigration that's going on in this time period. They're kind of painting a picture with the numbers. And for the first time, you're able to go and major in things in college like sociology and psychology and political science and urban planning and public health and things like that. So we're really starting to see people study society the way that they used to study science. And that's a big shift. These analysts provide the data and the reporting, and then the activists are the ones that take that data and take those numbers and act upon it, right? So they may do this by exposing political corruption in a political cartoon or in a newspaper article. They may do it by protesting for better wages or starting a labor union. They may do it by lobbying Congress to get Congress to pass a certain law that they feel is necessary. Activists have a whole bunch of different methods at their disposal. One group of progressive activists that was probably most notable during this time period was a group of journalists and authors known as the muckrakers. Why are they called muckrakers? Muckrakers are people who work in horse stables, and they rake up the floors of the stables, and on top of it they put down straw and things like that. But when you start raking up that straw, what you find underneath it is excrement, right? All the nastiness that the animals leave behind. And when you rake up the stuff on the top, you see what's really gross and disgusting underneath. And that's what the muckrakers were trying to do with society. They were trying to show that, kind of like Mark Twain said, we're living in a gilded age where only on the surface are things covered in gold. If you dig beneath the surface, you're going to find some really disgusting stuff. And so they wrote articles and books to bring national attention to these issues. Two of the most famous were Upton Sinclair, who wrote the book The Jungle, which I'll talk about in a minute, and that dealt with working conditions and food safety in America, especially in some of the slaughterhouses and the meat packing plants in the Midwest. Ida Tarbell, who was a notable columnist who wrote articles about the monopolistic tendencies of big corporations, most notably Standard Oil, and some of the columns that she wrote on Standard Oil ended up being the motivation for the federal government to try to break up Standard Oil as a result of using antitrust laws. The Jungle is a book that has a huge role in American history because of what it led to. The Jungle was originally a novel that was fictionalized. It wasn't a true story 100%, but it was based on real people doing real things. And it was supposed to be an expose of the horrible working conditions of immigrant laborers in America. But it ended up focusing on the disgusting conditions of a meatpacking plant in Chicago. And it ended up being something that caused outrage within American society. And Upton Sinclair said, I really didn't want this to be about the food industry. I wanted it to be about labor conditions in America. He was quoted as saying, "I aimed for the nation's heart and accidentally hit it in the stomach." So, You're probably somewhat familiar with the jungle, but I want you to refresh your memory a little bit. If you can pause the video at this point and go to the hyperdoc, there's a link to an excerpt on the jungle. So you're going to read like a one-page excerpt of the book, and then there's a short video on the jungle that I want you to watch. And once you've done that, you can come back to the presentation. Another type of progressive activist was the photojournalist. And this is a fairly new medium because cameras had finally developed to a point where they were portable enough and had the advantage of flash bulbs that could illuminate really dark areas to get good photographs, that we can actually now tell a story with pictures rather than having to write about it. So instead of describing seeing three young boys huddled into a stairwell sleeping because they were homeless, you take a photo of it, and you could really create a lot of emotional response in the American public through these photos. And so Lewis Hine and Jacob Riis are two of the most famous of the photojournalists that tried to influence people's thinking by using photography. And they were able to get into places that normally you wouldn't be able to take pictures of. So inside mines, inside factories, inside crowded apartment houses, because they had flash photography now. And these photos that they took were meant to make a change and to tell a story, and they were very effective at doing that. So I also want you to pause the presentation at this point. I want you to go and look at the supplementary things that I've linked to the hyperdoc on Lewis Hine and Jacob Riis, just to see some of their photos and to understand the impact that their work had. So just to summarize, now that you've had a chance to see some of those photos, this is a quote from Teddy Roosevelt before he became vice president or president of the United States. He was a New York City assemblyman. He was a one-time police commissioner in New York City. He eventually became the governor of New York, and of course, we know him best as president of the United States. He said, "The countless evils which lurk in the dark corners of our civic institutions, which stalk abroad in our slums and have their permanent abode in the crowded tenement houses, have met in Mr. Riis, the most formidable opponent ever encountered by them in New York City." And so Teddy Roosevelt's basically saying the work that Jacob Riis did to expose a lot of the issues with urbanization and immigration in New York City is immeasurable, the impact that he had on American society. So that's quite an important testimonial from a pretty important guy. So let's shift a little bit now from progressive activists who use the media to another type of progressive activist, which is the so-called whistleblower. A whistleblower is somebody, this is a word, by the way, that's obviously become part of our modern language. It's been brought back out into the forefront in the context of the Trump impeachment trial. But whistleblowers have been around forever. The first time the term whistleblower was used was back in the industrial era in the late 1800s. And the point of a whistleblower is to expose wrongdoing or corruption within an institution. That institution can be a business, it can be a school or a college, it can be a department of government. And so whistleblowers have played an important role in not only American society, but in international society, really since the Industrial Revolution. And whistleblowers often have a very mixed opinion by the public. Some people see them as heroes for exposing the wrongdoing or the corruption, and others see them as traitors or people who are just starved for attention or people who are trying to make a name for themselves. And I think they can be both. And I think some of them maybe are more about the attention than others, and some of them are more about just trying to do the right thing. But being a whistleblower is a very risky thing to be. You're taking on a powerful institution to call them out for something that they're doing wrong. You've got to imagine that there are going to be risks to your life or to your career, or maybe even to the well-being of your family and loved ones if you go forward with this information. And that's why there are whistleblower protection laws to try to keep these people anonymous as long as they want to be anonymous. So I'm going to have you guys watch this video on whistleblowers. So you're going to step away from this presentation for just a minute and you're going to watch this video on whistleblowers and just try to understand the role that whistleblowers have played throughout history and the controversies that are surrounding them. Turning the page a little bit to another type of activist, this is Jane Addams. And Jane Addams was unique in that she saw that the government was too slow to react to the needs of the people. And so Jane Addams had come from a wealthy family, and she decided she was going to use some of her personal wealth to try to solve the problem of poor immigrants not having decent shelter or decent services from the local government. And so she started to open up settlement houses. And a settlement house is kind of like a combination of an apartment house and a homeless shelter and like a community center and a daycare. It really has a bunch of different functions, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, but she opened these up in poor neighborhoods in Chicago. And not only did she open these things up to give a place for poor immigrant workers to actually go and live or to get services if they needed them, she actually moved into these settlement houses herself, and she lived among the poorest of the poor. So that she could understand their situation and that she could maybe, by understanding their situation, know how to help them better. And so a credit to her. She could have easily just thrown money at the problem and lived in a mansion somewhere, far away from the poor residents of Chicago. She chose to live among those people. So Hull House was the most famous of the settlement houses that she opened up. And I've just got a list here of some of the things that Hull House provided to the community. Free adult education classes in literature, history, art, and the domestic arts, things like cooking or sewing. Free concerts to bring a little culture to their lives. Free lectures on current and political issues. Social clubs for children and adults. A daycare center for kids who were too young to go to school or, sadly, during this era, maybe too young to work. A food bank, nutritious food distribution to the malnourished or sick. You could go to Hull House and you could get vegetables or cheese or milk or meats that you needed to feed your family. They had a temporary homeless shelter where you could stay for a day or a few days or a few weeks until you could get back on your feet. And then another thing you don't normally think about, public baths and showers. A lot of these tenement houses that the very, very poor immigrants, especially in the inner cities, lived in, did not have indoor plumbing. Or if they did, they had one bathroom that everyone would share. And I'll talk to you a little bit about the conditions of those tenement houses in a future lecture. But just the ability to get clean, the ability to have access to running water, the ability to clean yourself up, especially if you're working a hard industrial job. All of those things were provided by this Hull House. I should note before we get into the political stuff here that Jane Addams really started a movement, and other people opened settlement houses in other cities following in her footsteps. So it wasn't just one individual opening settlement houses. Settlement houses became a phenomenon nationwide. All right. Let's talk a little bit about some of the political reforms that the progressives were advocating. And we talked in our last unit about the problems of city machine politics and political corruption. We focused on Tammany Hall in New York City, but we also looked at some other examples. And we talked about how people tended to look the other way when they knew that there was political corruption, as long as the politicians made progress or at least did things that helped them out. But it was becoming toxic. These political machines in the inner cities were ripping off the taxpayer. They were running away with corruption. No one was holding them accountable. And so we're going to see some political reforms proposed during this period to take on the issue of the city machines and political corruption. One of the greatest advocates of these reforms was a guy named Robert La Follette, who was the governor of Wisconsin. And that's him at the microphone there. He was a little guy, but he had a big voice and a big spirit. And he believed in a package of reforms known as the Wisconsin idea that would tackle the corruption of the time period. So let me explain what his 4 pieces were. So he was advocating for direct primary, initiative, referendum, and recall. What do those things mean? Well, let's take them one at a time. Direct primary. That's what we're seeing happening in the current election. A direct primary is when the voters go to the polls and they get to choose between a bunch of different candidates. and they select the one that they think is best suited for the job, and the candidate who gets the majority of votes ends up becoming the nominee. Well, before direct primary, the political parties just picked their own nominees, right? They could just determine who they wanted to be the nominees. And so direct primary is not something that would only be done on a national level. It could also be done at a state or a local level as well to put power back in the hands of the people. Initiative. An initiative is the idea that the people, the voters, can propose ideas for new laws directly to the politicians. If you've got an idea for a law that you think should be debated and passed, you can write up that law. You can then get a bunch of signatures from people who also support the idea of that law. And if you get a certain number of signatures, the state assembly has to take up the measure. They have to at least debate it and consider it on the floor of the legislature. And so this gives the people a way to communicate to their elected leaders that these are laws and these are policies that we want to be implemented. Referendum. A referendum is a vote on how the government should behave. For example, if the government of Fairfax County wants to build a new school, they can't just do it. They have to ask the taxpayers to approve that. They have to give them a plan. This is where the school will be built. This is how big it will be. This is how many students it will serve. This is how much land we need. This is how much we believe it will cost to build. And then the taxpayers have to say yes or no to that. If they say no, then the school can't be built, at least not with taxpayer dollars. They can change the proposal and they can try again the next year and try to get the taxpayers to approve it. But in the end, it's up to the taxpayers to decide how they want large sums of those of the treasury of their city or their county or their state to be spent. And that's a huge improvement over Boss Tweed just doing whatever he wants whenever he wants to do it. And then finally, you've got recall. Recall, it's not used nationwide. It's not used on a national level. It is used in some states. And what recall allows you to do is to challenge a politician to run for re-election before the end of his or her term. So let's say that your governor gets elected. He's got a 4-year term. After a year or two, you realize he's not doing his job very well, or he's corrupt. He's just not suited to the task. If enough people sign a pledge or sign a petition, you can recall that governor, and that governor would then have to run for re-election early, and other people could challenge him. And if he doesn't do a good job campaigning, or he can't make a case for why he should remain governor, he gets kicked out and somebody else gets his job. And so this is supposed to be another way to hold politicians accountable so that they just don't run away with corruption. A couple of other ways that you could take on political corruption is the implementation of the Australian ballot. This was something that was originally used in Australia and then adopted in the United States. The ballot is printed at the public's expense. So the parties don't print the ballot. The ballot is printed by the Board of Elections in the city or in the state where the election's happening. All of the candidates' names have to be on the ballot. So you can't exclude people because of their political affiliation or their background. Everybody who qualifies to be on the ballot, their name has to be printed on the ballot. And all proposals that the taxpayers are going to vote on also have to be included on the ballot. The only place where you can get the ballot is when you show up to vote. You can't get it ahead of time. You can't mark it ahead of time. You can't have somebody else mark it for you. And the best thing of all is that you mark the ballot in secret. So you have a little booth that you go to. Nowadays, they use these little cardboard partitions. Back in the day, you used to go into these mechanical voting machines that had little levers that you would pull. You'd actually go into the voting booth and a curtain would close behind you so no one could see what you were doing. I remember going into those when I was a kid with my parents. And this way, no one can intimidate you. No one can intimidate you into voting for the machine boss or the party that was in power. You could vote any way you wanted and no one would ever know who you voted for. And that makes the elections more fair and more honest. Much later on, in 1913, the 17th Amendment passes. And the 17th Amendment, for the first time, allows for the direct election of U.S. senators, because previous to this, state legislatures appointed the U.S. senators from each state. This was actually something that the populists were asking for in the 1892 Omaha Platform. And this was something that eventually did happen, couple of decades later, but at the same time, it was something that they were asking for to end political corruption, and it was something that ended up passing during Woodrow Wilson's administration. All right, we're going to end the lecture with some thoughts about the role of Christianity and women in bringing about reform. There is a Christian movement that takes off during this time period called the social gospel. It's different than the gospel of wealth. Don't confuse it with the gospel of wealth, which Andrew Carnegie wrote. But the social gospel movement starts in New York City by a preacher named Walter Rauschenbusch in a really, really poor immigrant neighborhood known as Hell's Kitchen. And the social gospel movement basically says that as Christians, you have a duty to try to make life on earth better for people, right? To right the wrongs of society. So if you see poverty, if you see alcoholism, if you see domestic abuse or child labor, as a Christian, you have an obligation to call it for what it is. It's sinful. And you have a goal to use your time and your effort and your money to try to right the wrongs of society. If you ignore these things, if you turn a blind eye to these things, you're not being a good Christian. And so activism in the community becomes part of Christian life through this social gospel movement. You've got another group known as the WCTU, or the Women's Christian Temperance Union. This is a Protestant Christian group of women who see alcohol as evil. And we should point out that these are Protestant women, not Catholic women. And they're kind of stereotyping Catholic immigrants as people who have problems with alcohol. Okay, Irish Catholics are stereotyped as drunks and alcoholics. Italians and Jews use wine as a big part of their religious and cultural ceremonies. And so there was this feeling that Protestants were the kind of the original settlers of America, and they were very sober and very strict living individuals, and they wanted to bring America back to that. They wanted to remove alcohol from society completely. And so the Women's Christian Temperance Union was a big motivating force behind the eventual passage of the 18th Amendment, which led to the prohibition of alcohol for about a decade in America. Also have the women's suffrage movement, right? The women's suffrage movement has been going on seemingly forever. We talked about the Seneca Falls Convention back in 1848, but now the women's suffrage movement is making its way into the 20th century, and it's becoming more active, it's taking bolder steps, and it's getting more press. And so the feeling, again, is that women are never going to get the political, social, or economic equality that they deserve unless they can actually vote to shape the laws and to bring about politicians that will care enough to change their situation. And so the women's suffrage movement takes off in the early 20th century. It really gains traction because of women's efforts during the First World War, and eventually some of the activists of the suffrage movement are able to put enough pressure on President Woodrow Wilson and Congress to get the 19th Amendment to the Constitution passed. And we'll look more specifically at their efforts and at their campaign to get the right to vote in a later piece of our lesson, not in this lecture, but in another part of our unit. And so results of these movements, the results of these political reform movements, these economic reform movements, these social reform movements are actual changes to the Constitution, right? We're going to see the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendments. Those four are really going to be looked at as a package of progressive amendments. Remember, we looked at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments as a package of amendments that had to do with Reconstruction and the end of the Civil War. Well, now we're going to look at the 16th, which implements the income tax, the 17th, which implements direct election of senators, the 18th, which bans alcohol, and the 19th, which gives women the right to vote, as a package of reforms that really change American society during the progressive era. So here's just a picture of the suffragettes, and as I said, we'll come back to them and read an article and watch some videos about the movement a little bit later on. So that does it for the lecture today. You are going to continue learning about the progressive movement through the progressive presidents. There are other screencast videos linked on the hyperdoc for that, and you'll use those to continue filling in your lecture notes packet at home as part of your next homework assignment.